with Orange Tree, you're probably spoiled a little bit because they do these kinds of things and many other things on a regular ongoing basis. If you're considering a provider, you may want to consider Orange Tree because there really is a difference in the level of quality of the service that they provide. And we're really very appreciative to be associated with Orange Tree in providing these webinar presentations. That's just a little bit of legal garb there. As Lori pointed out, I've been doing this a long time. You're going to get a copy of this presentation so you can read my background at your leisure. But I do want to say something about the Current Consulting Group and how we relate to Orange Tree. We've been in business as the Current Consulting Group since 1998. We provide two kinds of services: compliance consulting services to support drug testing policies, supervisor training programs. We provide a very extensive database of state drug testing laws, and all of our services are available to you through Orange Tree. So if you're in need of any of those types of services, contact your Orange Tree rep and they will put you in touch with us so that we can help you with that. The other side of our business is marketing and sales support. We do a lot of that type of service for companies in the employee screening industry. Now, this is what we're going to talk about today: understanding where we are now and the trends that are shaping the future. And then I'm going to share some predictions for you for what I think is the future of drug testing and where we're going with that. And as I launch into that, I want to just point out that I made these predictions last year, and some of them have come to pass. And one of them there at the bottom, we really have not seen a tremendous amount of movement with, but definitely more marijuana legalization. I'm going to talk about all of these in more detail. More New York style limitations on drug testing and how to really work around them to your benefit. More employers dropping marijuana from their drug test panel. We've seen a continued movement in that direction, and more oral fluid drug testing. We haven't really seen a lot more with impairment or fitness for duty testing in conjunction with drug testing. So that's one prediction I made last year that hasn't really come to fruition yet, but I think it's going to. And so you're going to see that I included it in the predictions for 2023. Now, as I launch into that, into this part of the presentation, I'll tell you that every year the Current Consulting Group does two surveys. One, a survey of the drug testing industry, and two, a survey of employers related to drug testing. So the drug testing industry survey, we've done 24 years in a row. So 2023 will be our 25th annual drug testing industry survey. The employer survey is now in its 6th year. And we want to thank Orange Tree for being a corporate sponsor of that survey and making it possible for us to provide that kind of information. And the reason I mention it is because I've sprinkled into today's presentation information from our surveys, particularly the most recent one that just came out yesterday. So this is brand new information that you're probably not going to find anywhere else except in this presentation. So with that understanding, let's launch into where we are now. So this is a study that came out last year that showed that 49% of US workers are struggling with some type of substance abuse disorder. And look at the quote there, the italicized quote. Of the 49% of workers who reported struggling with some level of addiction, the number of workers reporting lower productivity and missed work because of substance abuse or addiction has nearly doubled since 2019. Surely, the pandemic has had an effect on that. So the next line reads, with 36% further reporting that it has affected their work more since the pandemic began. Nearly half of full-time workers now report problem use of alcohol, drugs, or prescription medication, and 19% report weekly usage. Now, why is this important? Well, because this is unlike the study that comes out from, or it's really a report that comes out from the federal government every year, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, which is fantastic. That just talks generally about the levels of substance abuse. This report was workplace specific. And so we know that a lot of people who have jobs also struggle with some type of substance abuse disorder, whether it's illicit drugs, alcohol, or maybe the abuse of otherwise legal drugs. And that abuse definitely makes its way into their job performance, lower productivity, missed work, tardiness, increased accidents, workers' comp claims, things of that nature. So A lot of this is tied to the legalization of marijuana. That certainly had an impact, and I've got some information coming up on that. But it all combines to motivate employers to establishing and maintaining a drug testing program. So one of the questions that we asked in this year's survey that came out yesterday is, what motivates you to conduct drug testing? So they could mark more than one, so you see the overlapping percentages. But if you look in the lower quadrant there, about 8 o'clock on the dial, 77% said it was to promote a healthy and safe workplace. And then at the opposite end, at about 2 o'clock on the dial, 72% said it was to comply with state and federal laws and regulations. Just below that, it was 60% said to minimize legal risks. Now, all of these things have one thing in common, all of these reasons and motivations. It all really comes back to the bottom line of that company. In other words, we drug test to control costs to improve the bottom line of our company. And clearly, substance abusers make less productive, less safe employees. And so that can be very costly to any workplace. And so as we ask this question in our annual survey of employers, we're not surprised by the responses, but we realize that they relate to bottom line issues and challenges that all companies are facing right now. There's a lot of other things that go with it, but it really comes down to the bottom line. Now, we also asked, what benefits do you think your company's getting out of drug testing? And as you start to the left and work your way across to the right, you see 83% said improving safety in the workplace, 38% improving productivity, 30% better morale among workers, 59% better company reputation, 17% less employee theft, 22% fewer confrontations in the workplace, and then all the way over to the right, 62% saying able to hire better quality employees. Now, before I get to the challenges of drug testing, let's focus on the benefits for a moment, okay? Again, if we look at these different responses that were offered, and of course there's overlap in the percentage because they could pick any that applied, we would expect to see hopefully an improvement in safety in the workplace. And although it's not asked in this question, a corresponding link to lower numbers of workers' comp claims or lower insurance premiums, things of that nature, right? So we improve safety in the workplace, and all of that has an impact on the others, you know, improving productivity, reducing employee theft, fewer confrontations. But then if you go all the way to the right, let's repeat this one, 62% able to hire better quality employees. That's important because one of the things you're going to see later in the presentation is that many companies are blaming drug testing and testing for marijuana in particular for having a hard time finding qualified workers or finding people to hire, right? It's a tight labor market. We understand that. But some companies are, I think, struggling with the issue of whether or not they should drug test or whether they should test for marijuana because of the difficulty in finding people to hire. If you're interested in hiring the best quality or better quality employees, then the answer is simple. Yes, you should continue conducting pre-employment drug testing and other forms of drug testing. It may take you a little longer to find the right person, and the right person is somebody that doesn't mind that your company conducts drug testing. The government did a survey, actually a survey of full-time employed individuals who admitted to being regular illicit drug users. So full-time workers using drugs. And 40% said they were less likely to work for a company that conducts random testing, and 30% said they were less likely to work for a company that conducts pre-employment testing. Well, that's okay. Let's get our cards out on the table. I don't want to hire that person anyway. I'll wait another week to fill this position if it means I can hire somebody who doesn't mind the fact that we conduct drug testing and that we are committed to a drug-free workplace because it improves safety, it improves productivity, et cetera, as you see across the board there. That doesn't mean that there aren't some challenges when it comes to drug testing. So in our survey, we asked, what are the biggest challenges to performing drug tests? And I'm going to focus on the top two for a minute. Arranging collections, 41%, and getting test results in a timely manner, 35%. And as you heard from Lori, one of the questions they get all the time is, what's your turnaround time? Because that's one of the big issues in our industry right now, is getting drug test results back in a timely manner. Obviously, if you're waiting for a drug test result to come back before you can finalize a job offer to somebody, and in the meantime, they've gone to another company to apply for a job, and maybe that company doesn't do drug testing, or maybe they do instant result drug testing, or maybe they just have a better provider who can get the results back. Maybe they're already working with Orange Tree. Well, that makes a difference in terms of that individual's objective for the day, which is very, very singular: get a job. And so if they have to wait 2 or 3 days to hear back from you, or maybe a week to hear back from you, and we're hearing that from many companies now, waiting up to a week to get a drug test result back, a negative drug test result back, well, that individual's probably taking a job somewhere else. There are ways to work around these two issues: arranging collections and getting test results back in a timely manner. And that's going to be part of the predictions that I'm going to share with you in a little bit. Right below that, though, 32% said marijuana legalization. And that's a source of consternation for many employers who either are under the impression that they can't test for marijuana anymore, and that's not true in almost every state, or that it's not worth the exposure to legal risk if they test individuals for marijuana, because a disgruntled individual who tests positive is maybe going to legally challenge that drug test result. And that can happen. We find that it's very rare that it happens, but it can happen. And some employers are concerned enough about it that they just don't test for marijuana at all. We're going to come back to that one in a little bit as well. Go down to the bottom two, and you'll have a chance to look at all of these: the cost of drug testing, the time that it adds to the hiring cycle, etc. But supervisors do not understand how to manage our program. 10% said that, and 9% said finding a reliable third-party administrator. So I'm going to just do a shameless plug for Orange Tree and say, just contact Orange Tree. They can solve both of those problems very quickly for you, okay? But don't let those two issues be a deterrent to doing drug testing. If your company wants to conduct drug testing, and it's a matter of getting these services in line so that these challenges, these obstacles are removed, then it can be done. It shouldn't stop you from doing drug testing, and there are many benefits that come from drug testing. But that's sort of setting the table for where we are now. And put your questions into the chat section, but pepper us with questions. We're happy to take any questions, whether it's related to the presentation or just about drug testing in general. But let us know what your questions are on sort of what we just talked about, sort of where we are now and what those challenges are and what we can do to help you get past those. But before I make my predictions, let's talk about a few trends that are shaping the future of drug testing. Now, I've been in the drug testing business for 32 plus years. I've seen a lot of different drug testing methods come and go. I've seen a lot of different changes. Back in the old days when I was at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the big issue was, whether employers should do drug testing. And then that sort of got resolved because drug testing proved to be very effective. And then it was, should we conduct random drug testing? And then, through various different sources like the DOT drug testing regulations, the Navy's drug testing program, we came to the conclusion that random testing is very effective at deterring drug use. Keeping in mind, for example, that a post-accident drug testing program doesn't deter accidents from happening. Random testing deters accidents from happening. But post-accident testing is very important if you're going to take adverse employment action, or you're going to move to deny workers' comp claims, which you can do in almost every state based on a positive drug test result. You need those post-accident drug test results. But the question then kind of went to the whole, should we do drug testing in this pro-marijuana, legalized marijuana era that we live in? And so those were the things that were sort of shaping the direction of drug testing in the past. Now we're in that different place where many employers are sort of confused about what their rights are, et cetera. And part of it's based on the fact that we're just seeing a lot more people test positive for marijuana. And that's having a direct impact on the thought process and the decisions that employers are making. Very large, famous worldwide companies are struggling with that issue, as well as small one-state companies. And we're also seeing some states passing legislation and enacting laws that are making drug testing a little bit more challenging. I'm going to give you some examples. And then we're also seeing, in response to those two trends, the marijuana issue and the drug testing itself issue, we're seeing a lot more attention being given to alternative drug testing methods, especially oral fluid drug testing. So let me take you through those 3 points one by one. More drug test results? Absolutely. According to the Quest Diagnostics Drug Testing Index, which comes out every year, which is, admittedly only a report on the drug tests conducted by Quest, but it's a lot. It's in, close to 10 million drug tests altogether that they do every year. Maybe it's a little more than that. They saw a definite increase in positive drug test results for marijuana over the last several years, but between 2021 and 2020, increasing about 8.3%. And it was the highest positivity rate for marijuana ever recorded in the history of the Quest Drug Testing Index. That tells you the trajectory that we're on right now, the roller coaster that we're on right now in terms of positive drug test results for marijuana. Over a 5-year period, positive marijuana results increased to 50% between 2017 and 2021. And then marijuana positives surged, especially in states that have legal recreational laws. 118% increase in positive results in states like California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, New York, New Jersey, etc. These states that have legalized the recreational use, or the so-called recreational use of marijuana, as opposed to all the others that have only legalized the medicinal use of marijuana. And then the overall positivity rate for all drugs conducted in 2021 was up 31% compared to 10 years ago. So we're seeing a lot more positive drug test results, especially for marijuana and especially in states that have legalized recreational use of marijuana. Okay, that's from the Quest Drug Testing Index. How did our survey fare on that question? So we asked employers, have positive drug test results increased over the past year? If you look over there at about 2 o'clock on the dial, about 30% said yes, and opposite of that, 62% said no. So you may look at those results and think, well, yeah, look at the vast majority said no. 30% positive, or 30% of our respondents saying that they've seen an increase in positive drug test results is a huge percentage increase. We've not seen that kind of an increase in 1 year. And I don't think we've ever seen that in the history of doing our survey. Now, we don't ask this question every year, but 30% of employers indicating that they've seen more positive drug test results in a 1-year period of time is a significant increase or a significant indicator of the increase in drug abuse among workers. Number 2, making laws that are passing laws that make drug testing harder. I'm going to give you one example here, and then later I'll give you a few more examples. But one example is a bill that was passed and signed by the governor of California, AB 2188, that beginning in January 2024 will make it unlawful for employers to discriminate against legal users of marijuana, okay? If the discrimination is based upon, among other things, an employer-required drug screening test that has found the person to have quote-unquote non-psychoactive cannabis metabolites in their hair, blood, urine, or other bodily fluids. In other words, you can only use a drug test result for marijuana in the state of California that is capable of detecting the parent drug, not a metabolite of the drug, but the parent drug. So when somebody smokes a joint, for example, it goes into the body and the body starts to break it down through into metabolites of the drug itself. Those metabolites don't necessarily indicate active or inactive or psychoactive or non-psychoactive. So the California laws is incorrect in the way that it states what is a non-psychoactive metabolite. So that's their problem. But for us, it's a concern because it basically would make it unlawful to use a drug test result that's only capable of showing the metabolite, i.e. urine testing, and would only leave room for drug testing methods that are capable of detecting the parent drug, or in other words, oral fluid or blood. Well, blood is not practical, of course, so that's going to leave you with only oral fluid as an option for testing for marijuana in the state of California. If you go a little bit further into this very short 1-page bill, it says that employees are not permitted to be impaired, to possess, or to use cannabis on the job, and the rights or obligations of an employer to maintain a drug-free workplace are still in effect as long as they comply with other laws and regulations, and I point out one from the Health and Safety Code in California. The point in all of this is that We're seeing some states, California being the latest, that are starting to put into effect conditions or restrictions on drug testing that don't outlaw drug testing, but they make it more challenging. If you're used to doing urine testing and you're in California, come 2024, unless something changes, you're probably going to have to switch to oral fluid testing. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I've got some good information coming up on oral fluid testing here in a second, but it's something that you have to be aware of. And that's in part why we've seen sort of a movement toward alternative drug testing methods. So the 5 major legitimate drug testing methods are lab-based urine and point of collection or rapid result urine, hair testing, lab-based oral fluid, and point of collection oral fluid testing or rapid result oral fluid testing. Now, I put 3 of them in, highlighted them in orange here, because the federal government has endorsed these 3 drug testing methods. We've had lab-based urine drug testing regulations and guidelines from the federal government for over 30 years. In October of 2019, SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, came out with final guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing. And in 2020, SAMHSA introduced a notice of proposed rulemaking, meaning they're looking for public comment because they intend to put out guidelines for hair testing. So not quite there yet for hair testing, but there are guidelines in place for lab-based urine and lab-based oral fluid testing. One of the questions I often get asked is, do you think the federal government will come out with guidelines for rapid result urine or rapid result oral fluid? And I think the answer to that is probably never. Certainly not in my career lifetime, which I figure I've got about 10 more years to work. But you never know with the federal government. Definitely, we've got lab-based urine and lab-based oral fluid testing. I think we will see regulations for hair testing. But what will state laws look like by the time those regulations come out? We'll have to see, right? In California, for example. Now, I will say this, in hair testing, you can technically detect the parent drug in a hair sample, but there's a lag time of about 7 to 10 days from the time somebody, say, smokes a joint before that marijuana usage becomes detectable in a hair sample. With urine, there's a lag time of about 6 to 7 hours. With oral fluid, because you're detecting the parent drug, there's only a lag time of about 10 to 15 minutes. So lab-based oral fluid testing is really sort of where you see the industry going in the future. And we asked that question in our drug testing industry survey earlier this year. In the future, what drug testing specimen will be used the most? 50% said urine, and 44, almost 45% said oral fluid. Now, again, we've been doing this particular survey, the drug testing industry survey, for, this is our 25th year, or will be our 25th year in 2023, and we've never seen a statistic like this before. In other words, there's been a huge sea change occur among drug testing professionals, among providers of drug testing services, where now 44, 45% think that in the future, oral fluid testing will be the most used method. Prior to the pandemic, we thought that the oral fluid market share was probably about 8%, giving you a little bit of, inside baseball there, right? About 8%. As a result of the pandemic, when a lot of employers had trouble getting urine collections done because many OC health centers were really focused on COVID testing and then eventually vaccines, we saw a lot of companies starting to look at oral fluid testing and using it maybe as an alternative to urine or maybe in conjunction with urine. But we definitely saw an increase in market share. I think it went up maybe about 2 to 3, maybe 4%, so somewhere around 10 to 12% market share total. But this is really sort of a stunning result where 45% of the drug testing industry believes that oral fluid will be the most used method in the future. Okay, so those are 3 significant trends that are shaping the future of drug testing. Now I'm going to share 5 things that I think you can look for in terms of what the future of drug testing will be. And as I present these to you, the value of this information, to whatever extent you trust my opinion on it, is to help you know the questions to ask your provider, in this case, Orange Tree, or to know the things that you should be considering in terms of updating your drug testing program or being prepared for the future by updating your drug testing policy. Your policy is so important. That's really the document that is the cornerstone of the legal defensibility of your program. Yes, the result has to be accurate. So you've got to work with reputable providers. But if there's ever a legal challenge, they're going to want to take a look at your policy. And we asked that question in the employer survey that we just put out yesterday. And it was an alarming percentage of companies that said that they've never updated their policy, or that it's been over 3 years since they updated their policy. As you'll see on this slide, when it comes to state drug testing laws, every year there are new laws. In 2022 alone, there were over 400 individual state bills that were considered that would have a direct impact on workplace drug testing. And here's some, I'm just highlighting a few here. You see at the top, I put in parentheses, legislation that would limit employer rights pertaining to cannabis using employees. So that would have a direct impact on drug testing and on what you can do with a drug test result. And then compare it to the legislation that would expand employer rights pertaining to cannabis using. And you can see it's very lopsided toward limiting employer rights as opposed to expanding employer rights. This is important for you to know, especially if you're in any of these states. Now, we did see that one bill, of course, passed in California. There was new legislation that was passed in the District of Columbia, and some of the other states here have already done the same thing. New Jersey, a big development there in New Jersey earlier this year. Keep that in mind as you contemplate what you're going to do with drug testing in 2023. A lot of movement in 2022. I suspect that we will see a lot of legislative movement in 2023 also, every year. Now, some of the bills deal with specific drugs, or they're, of course, every year we see medical cannabis legislation or recreational cannabis legislation. I mention that only because you may be in a state like California that already has a medical marijuana law and a recreational marijuana law, and yet they may look at legislation that would update their laws. And in some cases, like we saw in New Jersey, they place more restrictions on employers when it comes to what they can do with the drug test result. So it's always a good idea, and Orange Tree can help you with this, to keep up to date on developing legislation at the state level. Even if you think everything's already been settled, there's always legislation coming out that would update different laws that already exist. So for example, in California, I mentioned the AB 2188. Here's a quote from an article that was written, that was published in the Sacramento Bee, that's a newspaper, with a quote from, I think this was from the author of the bill, so an assemblyman in the state of California. It specifically bars employers from testing hair, blood, urine, or other bodily fluids. Now, as you read AB 2188, it leaves room for testing with a method that can detect the parent drug. That would include oral fluid testing. The way it's written here, and the intent of the author of the bill, was to bar employers from testing for marijuana, period. We'll see what happens over the next year. I've written an article that's going to come out next week on this that goes into very specific detail on what the law says and what the law doesn't say. But this clearly seems to be the intent in California, not unlike what New York did last year when the State Department of Labor came out with guidance that prohibits employers from testing for marijuana, period. Not just pre-employment, but all forms of drug testing for cannabis. In the Department of Labor guidelines that came out, the question is posed, it's a question and answer guide. Can an employer test for cannabis? And the answer was no, unless the employer is permitted to do so pursuant to the provisions of Labor Law Section 201-34-A or other applicable laws. When you go into the Labor Law Section 201, etc., you find that it's not really allowing employers to do drug testing except under very limited circumstances. So that might be police officers, for example, or firefighters, or other sort of safety sensitive occupations, though it does not specifically have a safety sensitive carve out in that New York DOL guidance. The intent of the Department of Labor guidance was to bar employers from conducting drug tests for cannabis, not other drugs. And New York may have a different idea on this, but it also has no effect on the DOT, the United States Department of Transportation, drug and alcohol testing regulations. If you're covered under the DOT regs in New York, you still have to do all the things that have traditionally been required under the DOT regs, including pre-employment testing, post-accident, reasonable suspicion, random, etc. That includes marijuana. Now, an interesting thing about the Nevada law, I'm going to quote from it, is that it allows employers to test for marijuana, but it makes it illegal for employers to take any adverse employment action based on that positive result. So for example, when this is from a synopsis or a summary of the law, when Nevada's governor signed Assembly Bill 132, Nevada became the first state to make it illegal for employers to turn down job applicants for testing positive for cannabis in a pre-employment drug screening. That's very unique to Nevada, but not so unique that you couldn't make that same claim in a few other states. For example, in Illinois, the bill would, quote, prohibit most employers from firing workers or discriminating against job applicants merely for testing positive for marijuana use. And you may be asking yourself, why then test for marijuana? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, right? You may not base the adverse employment action that you decide to take strictly on the marijuana positive result, but you might use it in conjunction with documented reasons that triggered the drug test in the first place. Increased absenteeism, a confrontation in the workplace, unusual accidents, etc., all documented through supervisor observation of employees' performance, and then using that to trigger a reasonable suspicion drug test, for example, and then getting a positive result back that in combination with these other factors maybe justifies adverse employment action. You can't do it based solely on the positive drug test result, or as they say here, merely for testing positive. But that positive drug test result is not useless, and it could come in handy, especially if you're going to move to deny workers' comp benefits to somebody who was involved in an accident and it turns out they tested positive. There could be something in the Illinois workers' comp regulations that allows an employer to use that drug test result of proof of impairment, even though technically the drug test result doesn't prove impairment, but it could be used to bolster an employer's case to move to deny workers' comp benefits to somebody who tests positive. Those workers' comp regulations that allow the movement to deny a claim are different in every state, but many states do allow that to happen. So you don't want to discontinue drug testing, even in Illinois or even in Nevada, but you want to keep an eye on these laws because while they don't eliminate or bar employers from conducting drug testing, period, they do place a few conditions in the way that you want to make sure are incorporated into your drug testing policy. And then as a company like Orange Tree is helping to administer your program, they're helping you work around those challenges to make sure that you're getting the maximum benefit from your drug testing program in states like Illinois, Nevada, New York, and New Jersey, or California. I could have used New Jersey as one of the examples, but we have plenty there. Okay, in the future, what will be the status of testing for marijuana? That's another prediction I'm going to make here. We asked companies, what is your company's position on testing for marijuana as part of our employer survey? You see all the way to the left, about 75% said we test for marijuana and we plan to continue testing for marijuana. Seems like a very high percentage, and it is by comparison, but just 5 years ago, it would have been 95% probably, or go back a little further than that. It would have been a much higher percentage. Now, look in the middle, 4.7, let's say 4.8% said we are considering dropping marijuana in the next year, and 5% said we've already dropped marijuana from our drug test panel. So that's almost 10% of the employer respondents to our survey indicating that they had either dropped marijuana from their drug test panel or they were considering doing so. That's a pretty significant movement toward not testing for marijuana. I predict in the next year to 2 years, we'll see an increase there. And then all the way to the right, we're not sure what to do about testing for marijuana, 15%. And that, of course, creates opportunities for professionals in the drug testing industry to provide good information that employers can use to make important decisions regarding their drug testing program. Now, we also asked, what's your level of concern about marijuana legalization when it comes to safety, productivity, employee morale, finding quality employees, absenteeism, turnover, and company reputation? So you're going to have to come back and watch the presentation again to sort of delve into these numbers here, because there's a very concerned, slightly concerned, and not concerned at all. result under each of those categories: safety, productivity, etc. But if I just looked at the bottom, under safety, 23% not concerned. Under productivity, 25% not concerned. 32.5% not concerned about the effect of legalized marijuana on employee morale, etc. Just going across the bottom, you can say that the average is, let's be generous and say the average is 30%. It's probably just slightly below that, but let's say it's 30%. That means that in all of those categories, all 7 categories, about 70% had some concern, even if it was just slightly concerned, or they were concerned, or they were very concerned. So that's important to know as well, because as employers, you fall into these categories, and you may be having discussions internally in your company about the effect of legalized marijuana on safety, on productivity, on absenteeism, etc. We ask companies why they might drop marijuana from their drug testing panel, and again, they could pick whichever result they wanted. But look at, there were 2 that said 55%. 55% indicated what employees do in their own time is not our company's business. And 55% said we cannot find new employees due to marijuana positive drug test results. Okay, I'm a little less sympathetic with both of those, but those were the top reasons indicated by the participants in our survey. 25% said we don't believe in testing for marijuana, and 25% said we are concerned about lawsuits and legal liability, and 5% said testing for marijuana is not permitted in our state. Unless they're in New York, that's not true. New York, even in New York, there's a little narrow path available for reasonable suspicion drug testing. My point here is that companies are rethinking the whole issue of testing for marijuana. And when we asked drug testing providers, have they had companies remove marijuana from their drug testing panel? As you can see, from 2019 at 17%, and 2020 at 45%, and 2021 at 63%, it's definitely a significant, very definite trend that more and more companies are removing marijuana from their drug test panel. Now, the 63% at the top doesn't mean 63% of their clients. It just means 63% of drug testing companies indicated that they've had at least one company drop marijuana from their drug testing panel. We know from the slide right here that it's probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10% of companies that have removed marijuana. So it's not 63%, but it's a significant trend that we're starting to see throughout the industry. So I think we're going to see more companies in 2023 drop marijuana from the drug testing panel. Part of the reason for that is they may be facing a drug testing law like in California, where they're not allowed to do urine testing or hair testing anymore. And so it's important to be able to discuss or be able to present the option of oral fluid testing, or consider that option. And I'm not going to read all of these. I'm going to go through these next 3 slides fairly quickly. But these are the reasons why SAMHSA decided to go ahead and issue final guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing. Enhanced flexibility, enhanced versatility, decreased invalid tests, saves time, versatility in detection. Those are all among the attributes of oral fluid testing cited by SAMHSA when they put out those regulations. But I like this one. This is what they said about the science. The scientific basis for the use of oral fluid as an alternative specimen for drug testing has now been broadly established, and the advances in the use of oral fluid in detecting drugs have made it possible for this alternative specimen to be used in federal programs with the same level of confidence that has been applied to the use of urine testing. That's significant, right? Because when you talk about a different method for drug testing or something you're considering, you want to ask 3 questions. Is it legal? Is it accurate? And is it practical? Well, oral fluid testing, lab-based oral fluid testing is legal in 47 states with the exception of Vermont, Maine, and Hawaii. And I think those 3 are going to change now that there are SAMHSA guidelines in place. Is it accurate? Well, here you have the quote from the federal government about the scientific basis for the use of oral fluid testing, now at the same level of confidence as urine testing. And is it practical? That's, can it work? Can we get this done? Is it going to speed up our workflow during the day? And the answer to that is yes, because oral fluid samples are typically easier to conduct than urine samples. But when DOT put out their notice of proposed rulemaking earlier this year, February 28th, for oral fluid testing, they checked off all the same things. They were looking at all the same attributes of oral fluid testing as part of their justification for developing what will eventually be final regulations for the use of lab-based oral fluid testing in the DOT regulations. It's interesting because when SAMHSA put out their guidelines back in October 2019, they predicted that in the first year after the regulations were implemented, that about 7% of federal workplaces would switch to oral fluid testing, and that over a 4-year period, about 25 to 30% would switch to oral fluid testing. They predicted about the same rate for DOT tests, and if you looked at the same rate for non-DOT tests, you're looking at somewhere around 15 to 16 million drug tests out of a market of about 40 million drug tests a year. So that's pretty significant, right? And I think part of the reason for that has to do with the window of detection with the drug testing methods versus the window of impairment. There was a study that came out in 2021 on the window of impairment for marijuana. How long does somebody remain impaired by marijuana? Without going into all of the aspects of that, it's a pretty detailed report. Basically, they came to the conclusion that marijuana impairment typically lasts 3 to 10 hours. And so the only drug testing method that covers that entire 3 to 10 hour window of impairment is oral fluid. Urine starts a little bit too late. Breath, which doesn't really exist yet for drug testing, but it's in the works, has a very short 2 to 3 hour window of detection. So you would be missing about 70 to 80% of the righteous positives with breath testing. You'd be missing about 60 to 70% with urine testing. And if your objective is to identify people who need help or deter drug use, you're going to want a method that covers that entire window of detection. And I think that's in part why we're seeing a fairly significant increase in the level of interest in oral fluid testing. And I think I'm predicting that we'll continue to see that. Remember, about 40%, 45% of people in the drug testing profession believe it's going to be the most used drug test method in the future. When we asked, are you interested in oral fluid testing due to recent use detection capabilities, 43% said yes, 40% were neutral, only 17% disagreed with that. So when you go back to this slide and you think about the value of a drug testing method in terms of correlating to recent use and the possibility of impairment, like you would be forced to do in a state like Illinois with their marijuana law, then oral fluid, I think, is a strong argument there. And that's one of the reasons why I'm predicting that it's going to be more popular in the future. Very quickly, fitness for duty testing. I think we're going to see more of that as companies look for non-drug testing impairment testing methods. When we asked that question in our survey, you can see that, you know, all the way to the far right, almost, well, about 30% said no. Yes, but not entirely, about 25%, a little over that. Yes, with non-drug testing related impairment or fitness for duty testing, about 7% indicated that. So I think you're going to see more of that in the future as well. The pupillary exams or the computer-based testing methods that create a sort of a base level of what would indicate impairment on an employee-by-employee basis. I think we're going to see a lot more alcohol testing. This report came out last year that showed that the simultaneous use of marijuana and alcohol is very prevalent, and that most marijuana users also consume alcohol at the same time, which doubles the likelihood of impairment, and that probably increases the odds of drunk driving or driving under the influence or driving while impaired. How significant do you think the alcohol problem is? You can see as you look down below there that about, whoops, went too far, sorry. That about 27% said it is somewhat significant to very significant to just significant. So not as many companies as concerned with alcohol abuse in their workplace as you would see with drug abuse. Only 75% said they conduct alcohol testing. That's what we would normally expect, because alcohol testing is less popular generally because you usually don't use it for pre-employment or random testing. As you can see here, what's the total amount of alcohol tests that you conduct in a year? Typically very low, because it's usually just used for post-accident and reasonable suspicion. The most popular alcohol testing method continues to be EBTs, evidential breath testing devices. You'll have these slides so you can look at all the other results from it as well. Let me go to my conclusion real quickly here. I think that we're going to see those trends, right? More marijuana being dropped from drug test panels, more oral fluid testing, more fitness for duty testing, probably more alcohol testing as well, as employers realize that there's a connection between drug tests or marijuana use and alcohol abuse. But I want to make two other predictions in closing. I think that we're going to see other types of methods of testing and collection to solve that problem of getting collections done. Oral fluid helps with that because it's so easy to do. You can do it in your own workplace. Rapid result testing to solve that turnaround problem. I think we'll see an increase there as well. And then telehealth collections. I think that's becoming a big thing. About somewhere between 5 and 7% of employers indicate that they're interested in telehealth collection solutions. That's typically going to involve oral fluid, right? Because it's a video observed or video recorded collection process. And then I think we're going to see, of course, more marijuana legalization. You don't have to be a genius to predict that, but it will lead to less testing for marijuana. But we're also seeing an increase in other types of drug abuse. And so you're going to see employers adding expanded panels for opiates, opioids in particular. And then, you know, we just don't know what the future is going to involve and include involving fentanyl, but that's definitely becoming an epidemic in our country. So, and it's affecting the workplace as well. So that's a lot of information, a lot of predictions. Let me turn it back over to Lori for any questions or final comments.
Thank you, Bill. That was some great information. I'm sure everybody really appreciate it. I do have one question that came in, and I know you discussed a little bit of this, but any other information or more details would be appreciated too by this attendee. Sandy asked that they are, let's see, how do you test for psychoactive versus non-active drugs? She says our drug tests for THC, which should be the psychoactive testing, would they need to change that?
Well, Sandy, let me first say that you're brilliant because you've actually hit the nail on the head. A drug test, whether it's instant result or in a lab with oral fluid or urine, let's just compare those two, doesn't distinguish whether the metabolite that's identified is non-psychoactive or currently an active psychoactive metabolite. It just doesn't have the capability of doing that. So, and I've read a lot of research on the whole issue of psychoactive versus non-psychoactive metabolites. And the smartest people in the world, much smarter than myself, come to the conclusion that there are psychoactive and non-psychoactive metabolites that can be detected in a person's system, but it doesn't necessarily, but the test itself doesn't distinguish between psychoactive and non-psychoactive. For example, let's say that the window of impairment for marijuana is 3 to 10 hours, like the University of Sydney report I referred to earlier. That means that somebody who's under the influence and impaired at the 2-hour mark is potentially just as dangerously impaired at the 6 or 7 or 8 or 9-hour mark. And so later in the drug testing process, or excuse me, with urine testing early in the process, well, with urine, you're going to detect a metabolite, but it's not going to be, the drug test result itself is not going to be able to distinguish between a psychoactive and a non-psychoactive metabolite. That's just misleading to say it that way. So I think you've hit the nail on the head. Depending on your drug testing program, Sandy, I would say that you build into your drug testing policy, the written policy, that the company drug tests for marijuana using whatever your method of choice is. Let's say it's urine testing, and that we will look at the results in combination with other factors to determine whether some type of adverse employment action is justified, including maybe suspension or termination or a second chance agreement, etc. But the drug testing method itself, I don't think is going to make a big difference, although I think we're going to see more oral fluid testing because it's capable of detecting the parent drug. And so the whole California argument goes away with oral fluid testing. But I don't think we're going to see a lot of those types of laws yet, although we're going to see some of them in 2023.